January 24, 2023. A quiet street in Duxbury, Massachusetts. A 911 dispatcher picks up a call that will end with 3 young children dead, their mother paralyzed from the waist down, and a legal battle that is still unfolding today, more than 3 years later. On the other end of the line is Patrick Clancy. He has just come home from running errands. He is asking for help. What happened inside that house in the 25 minutes he was gone would become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in the country, and it would force an uncomfortable national conversation about a condition many people had never heard of: postpartum psychosis. This is the story of Lindsay Clancy, a labor and delivery nurse, a mother of 3. A woman who, according to her own legal team, was so unwell in the weeks before that January afternoon that she checked herself into psychiatric care more than once, begged doctors for help, and still ended up accused of killing the 3 children she had spent years trying to have. She has pleaded not guilty. Her attorneys do not deny that she caused her children's deaths. What they dispute is whether she can be held criminally responsible for it at all. As of this recording, a jury has just been seated in Plymouth Superior Court, and the trial that will decide that question is only beginning. Before we go further into this case, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Vault and tap that notification bell. We cover ongoing investigations and active trials as they develop, with new uploads every week, and a case like this one is going to keep evolving for weeks to come. If you want to follow it with us, now is the time to subscribe. To understand what happened in that house, you have to understand who Lindsay Clancy was before it. She grew up wanting to help people. Friends and co-workers who later spoke to investigators and to reporters described her as warm, competent, and completely devoted to her patients. She built a career as a labor and delivery nurse, spending her working life in the same rooms where other families welcomed their own children into the world. She met Patrick Clancy, and the two built a life together outside Boston, eventually settling into a house in Duxbury, a coastal town known for its quiet streets and strong sense of community. Between 2017 and 2022, Lindsay and Patrick had 3 children. Cora came first, then Dawson, then, in the spring of 2022, their youngest, Callan. By every account given to investigators and later repeated in court filings, this was a family that others looked at and admired. Lindsay was active on social media, sharing images of her children, of family trips, of ordinary domestic life. Nothing in the public record from those years suggests anything other than a woman who wanted to be a mother, and who, by most measures, was good at it. Co-workers at the hospital where she worked described a nurse who was steady under pressure, the kind of person other staff wanted in the room during a difficult delivery. Neighbors in Duxbury described a young family that fit seamlessly into a town built around exactly that image. Good schools, quiet cul-de-sacs, families who knew each other from school pickup lines and weekend youth sports. None of that context excuses anything that came later. But it matters, because one of the central questions this case keeps forcing people to confront is how a life that looked, from every visible angle, stable and even enviable, could be hiding a crisis severe enough to end the way this one did. It's a question maternal mental health researchers say comes up constantly in cases like this one. The outward appearance of coping and the internal reality of a psychiatric emergency can diverge completely. And by the time the gap becomes visible to the outside world, it is often already too late. Something changed after Callan's birth. According to statements later filed by Clancy's own legal team, in the months following the birth of her 3rd child, Lindsay began to unravel. She reported trouble sleeping. She reported anxiety that did not fade with time, the way ordinary postpartum stress usually does. And, according to the civil lawsuit she and her husband later filed against her medical providers, she began hearing voices. Voices that, according to her account, told her to hurt herself and to hurt her children. This detail matters enormously to understanding everything that follows, so it is worth pausing on. Postpartum psychosis is a real, documented, and extremely rare psychiatric emergency. It is distinct from the baby blues, and it is distinct from ordinary postpartum depression, which affects a much larger share of new mothers and rarely, if ever, involves a break from reality. Postpartum psychosis, by contrast, can include hallucinations, delusions, and a loss of connection with reality itself, typically beginning within the first few weeks after childbirth. Medical literature consistently describes it as a psychiatric emergency requiring immediate hospitalization. It is also, doctors stress, highly treatable when caught early. The tragedy at the center of every case like this one is the same question. Was it caught early enough, and was it treated correctly? According to Clancy's own account, filed in a civil complaint against several of her healthcare providers, it was not. The lawsuit alleges that in the weeks before January 24, 2023, Lindsay Clancy did what she believed a person in her situation should do. She recognized something was wrong. She sought medical treatment. She went to emergency rooms. She called crisis hotlines. She admitted herself to a psychiatric hospital, not once, but on more than one occasion in the weeks leading up to the deaths of her children. She was prescribed medication, and according to her legal team, an unusually high number of different medications in a short window of time, which they argue worsened rather than stabilized her condition. Her attorneys have said she communicated to her providers that the medications were making her worse. She was, in her own family's telling, actively trying to save herself and her children from whatever was happening inside her mind, and reaching out through every channel available to a person in crisis. This is the account given by Lindsay Clancy and her family. It is important to say clearly that it comes from a civil lawsuit filed by Clancy herself, and it has not been tested in the criminal trial that is only now getting underway. The prosecution in the criminal case has a very different characterization of what happened, and we'll get to that. But to understand the defense that is about to be argued in a Massachusetts courtroom, you need to understand this timeline as her side has laid it out. A woman who says she was sounding every alarm available to her, and a healthcare system her family says failed to catch what was coming. It's worth pausing here to ask a question that will likely come up again and again as this trial unfolds. How does a person get hospitalized multiple times for a psychiatric crisis, get released, and end up back in a situation where she is alone with 3 young children again? That question doesn't have a simple answer, and it's one that hospital systems, insurers, and psychiatric professionals have struggled with for years, long before this specific case. Postpartum psychiatric units are frequently under-resourced. Insurance coverage for extended inpatient psychiatric stays is often limited, and the standard for involuntary commitment, even when a patient reports frightening symptoms, requires meeting a specific legal threshold of imminent danger, one that can be difficult to establish in the moment, especially when the person in crisis is, like Lindsay Clancy reportedly was, still functional enough to communicate clearly, hold a conversation, and in some cases return home in between hospital stays. None of this is offered as an excuse. It's offered as context for a question this entire trial is going to force the public to sit with. What does the system actually owe a mother who is asking for help and not fully getting it? What was coming, according to prosecutors, was not a sudden break with reality. It was something calculated. On the afternoon of January 24, 2023, Patrick Clancy left the family's home in Duxbury to run a series of errands. According to investigators, in the time before he left, Lindsay had asked questions about how long those errands might take. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not idle curiosity. They allege it was reconnaissance, a way of calculating exactly how much time she would have alone in the house with her children. Patrick was gone for roughly 25 minutes. When he returned home, he found his 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 7-month-old Callan, unresponsive. He called 911 immediately. First responders arrived, and despite their efforts, all 3 children were pronounced dead. Investigators determined that the children had died from strangulation. We are not going to walk through the physical details of that scene beyond what has already been established in court filings and public reporting, because those children were 3 individual human beings, not props in a story, and there is nothing to be gained by lingering on the specifics of how they were found. What matters for understanding the case is this. Prosecutors allege Lindsay Clancy killed all 3 of her children in the window of time her husband was out of the house, and that when he returned, it was already too late. Lindsay was also found badly injured. According to court records and public reporting, in the aftermath of her children's deaths, she attempted to take her own life, an attempt that involved a fall from a second-story window of the home. She survived, but the injuries left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. She has required extensive medical care ever since, including at Duxbury Hospital, a state facility where she has remained under court-ordered treatment for much of the time between her arrest and her trial. If any part of this story is affecting you personally, please know that support exists. In the United States, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available by call or text any hour of any day, and postpartum mental health support is available through organizations like Postpartum Support International. You are not required to carry something like this alone. Lindsay Clancy was arrested on January 24, 2023, the same day her children died. She was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and additional charges related to strangulation. From the very beginning, her defense team signaled the direction they intended to take. At her arraignment, her attorney stated that she had been suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the killings, describing a combination of postpartum depression, likely postpartum psychosis, and what he called catastrophic overmedication. Kevin Reddington, the veteran Massachusetts defense attorney representing Clancy, has been direct about the argument he plans to make. He has said publicly that Lindsay had been prescribed as many as 12 different psychiatric medications in the period surrounding her hospitalizations, a combination he has described in blunt terms as horrific, and one he argues contributed directly to the loss of touch with reality that led to the deaths of her children. His position, consistent from the earliest hearings to now, is that Lindsay Clancy should not be held criminally responsible for actions committed while she was legally insane. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts sees it differently. Prosecutors have consistently argued that the killings were intentional and premeditated, pointing to details like the timing of Patrick's errands as evidence of planning rather than a psychotic break. This is the fundamental divide at the heart of this trial, and it's worth being precise about what it actually is, because it gets mischaracterized constantly online. This is not a case where the defense is claiming Lindsay Clancy did not cause her children's deaths. Her attorneys do not dispute that she did. The legal question the jury will be asked to answer is narrower and, in many ways, harder. Whether, at the moment she acted, a severe mental illness left her unable to understand what she was doing was wrong, or unable to conform her conduct to the law. Under Massachusetts law, a successful insanity defense does not mean walking free. It means being committed, often indefinitely, to secure psychiatric treatment instead of prison. Legal analysts who have followed the case have called it one of the clearest tests of an insanity defense to reach trial in years. As one attorney not involved in the case put it in an interview ahead of jury selection, this is about as squarely in the middle of a not guilty by reason of insanity case as you're likely to see, and she noted something else worth sitting with. Jurors in this case are going to have to set aside enormous emotion because there are 3 child victims at the center of it, and emotion is not a legal standard. The path to trial itself took years, and it was anything but simple. Clancy's case moved slowly through the Massachusetts court system for more than 2 years after her arrest, delayed repeatedly by pretrial motions, medical evaluations, and disputes between prosecution and defense over evidence. In the months leading up to the eventual trial date, her legal team requested a court-ordered forensic mental health evaluation, a standard but critical step in building an insanity defense, which was carried out in the spring. For a while, it wasn't even clear the trial would happen this year at all. It had already been postponed more than once, pushed back as both sides argued over access to medical records, over which experts would be permitted to testify, and over how much of Lindsay's psychiatric history prosecutors would be allowed to obtain and use. Every one of those delays added to a timeline that, for Patrick Clancy and for the extended families on both sides, meant living for years without resolution, without a verdict, and in Lindsay's case, without leaving a hospital room except for court appearances. Clancy's physical condition complicated nearly every stage of the pretrial process. Being paralyzed from the waist down and requiring ongoing medical care meant she could not simply be transported and held the way most criminal defendants are. For most of the period between her arraignment and the start of trial, she remained under treatment at Duxbury Hospital, a state-run facility, appearing at hearings by video link far more often than in person. When she did appear in the courtroom itself, for the first time in February of this year, it was treated as a notable moment in the case, requiring careful coordination between the court, her medical team, and law enforcement. One of the more unusual fights in the pretrial period involved a magazine. Patrick Clancy had given an extended interview to a reporter at The New Yorker about his wife's mental health in the period before their children's deaths. Prosecutors moved to obtain the full notes and recordings from that interview, arguing that Patrick's account to the journalist contained statements relevant to understanding Lindsay's state of mind, including, according to one prosecutor, statements Patrick relayed about the crime itself. The magazine did not fight the request, but the episode illustrates just how much of this case is played out not only in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, through interviews, lawsuits, and fundraising pages. That public dimension became especially visible after a GoFundMe campaign, started in the aftermath of the killings, in which Patrick Clancy asked for financial support while also asking the public not to define his wife by the worst day of her life. He described her, in his own words, as someone whose caring nature ran through everything she did, toward her patients, her friends, her family, her own children, and he said all he wished for her now was some measure of peace. That framing was not universally accepted. The case, and Patrick's public defense of his wife, drew intense scrutiny and no shortage of public anger, particularly from people who felt that no mental health explanation could account for the deaths of 3 children. That tension between clinical explanation and public grief has followed this case from the first week to the opening of the trial. Clancy and her husband went further than public statements. Earlier this year, the two of them filed a civil lawsuit against several of Lindsay's medical providers, alleging that they failed to properly diagnose, monitor, and treat what the lawsuit describes as a severe postpartum psychiatric condition. The suit lays out in detail a timeline of hospital visits, medication changes, and crisis calls in the weeks before the killings, arguing that at multiple points, the healthcare system had the information it needed to intervene and did not. It is a striking legal strategy. The same woman facing 3 counts of first-degree murder is simultaneously arguing, in a separate courtroom, that the system that was supposed to protect her and her children failed both of them. Prosecutors have pushed back hard against efforts by the defense to control the narrative before trial. At one point, reporting indicated that Clancy's team had explored the possibility of an admission tied to a reduced charge, an approach prosecutors resisted, continuing instead to press for the case to be tried in full on the original murder charges. The defense also asked the court to consider bifurcating the trial, essentially splitting the proceedings into 2 phases, one to determine whether Clancy committed the acts, and a separate phase to determine her mental state and criminal responsibility. Those pretrial motions were argued in hearings stretching from late last year into this spring, with Clancy appearing by video link from her hospital bed for much of it, and in person for select hearings once logistics could be arranged, including the considerable challenge of transporting a patient who remains paralyzed and reliant on ongoing medical care to and from a courthouse for what is expected to be a 6 to 8 week trial. That challenge became its own small saga. Advocates for Clancy pushed to secure appropriate medical transport, specifically an ambulance equipped to move her safely between the hospital and the courthouse for what will be weeks of daily proceedings, a level of logistical complexity that is itself a reminder of just how severe her physical injuries from that January night remain more than 3 years later. As of this recording, the trial has formally begun. Jury selection started on July 20th of this year in Plymouth Superior Court. It took several days. On the first 2 days, 12 jurors were chosen. By the third day, the pool had grown to 17, though 2 previously seated jurors were later excused. A final jury of 12 women and 6 men, accounting for alternates, was seated this week. Opening statements are expected to follow almost immediately, with witness testimony beginning shortly after. Court officials and attorneys on both sides have estimated the trial itself could run anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, meaning a verdict is not expected until sometime in the fall. That means, as you're watching this, the outcome of the Lindsay Clancy case is still unknown. We are not going to pretend otherwise, and we are not going to speculate about a verdict that hasn't happened. What we can tell you is what both sides have said they intend to argue, because that much is already part of the public record. The prosecution is expected to lean heavily on the timeline of that January afternoon, arguing that the deliberate nature of sending Patrick out of the house, and the questions about how long he would be gone, point to premeditation rather than a sudden psychotic episode. They are expected to call witnesses from the scene, from the investigation, and potentially medical experts of their own, to argue that whatever mental health struggles Clancy was experiencing, they do not meet the legal bar required for a finding of insanity. The defense, for its part, is expected to build its entire case around Clancy's psychiatric history in the weeks before the killings, the hospitalizations, the medication changes, the crisis calls, and expert testimony intended to establish that she met the clinical and legal definition of insanity at the moment the acts occurred. Kevin Reddington has said he intends to call the people in Lindsay's life who knew her before that day, co-workers, friends, family, to testify to the person she was for the entirety of her adult life prior to a mental health crisis he argues overtook her in a matter of weeks. Patrick Clancy himself is expected to testify. His account carries enormous weight in this case, both because he is the one who came home and found his children, and because he has been, throughout, both a witness for the prosecution's timeline and a public advocate for his wife's defense, a duality that has made him one of the more scrutinized figures connected to this trial. Legal observers following the case have noted that Massachusetts juries have historically been reluctant to return not guilty by reason of insanity verdicts in nauseous cases involving child victims, regardless of the strength of the psychiatric evidence presented, simply because of how difficult it is for jurors to separate the emotional weight of the crime from the clinical question they are legally required to answer. Whether that pattern holds here, with a defense this well documented and this thoroughly supported by pre-crisis medical records, remains to be seen. It's a pattern that shows up far beyond Massachusetts. Insanity defenses succeed in only a small fraction of the cases where they're raised nationally, and they succeed even less often when the victims are the defendant's own children, even in cases with extensive documented psychiatric histories. Legal scholars who study this area point to a difficult truth. Juries are asked to apply a cold legal standard to one of the most emotionally devastating fact patterns imaginable, and most people, understandably, struggle to fully separate the two. That tension is likely to define jury selection, testimony, and closing arguments in this case from beginning to end. The 18 people seated in that Plymouth Superior Court jury box did not just agree to listen to evidence. They agreed to sit through weeks of testimony about the deaths of 3 young children and then apply a legal test that has nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with a narrow, technical question about Lindsay Clancy's state of mind in a specific 25-minute window on a single afternoon in January of 2023. Beyond the courtroom, this case has already had an impact that will outlast whatever verdict is eventually reached. It has become one of the most widely discussed cases in the ongoing public conversation about perinatal and postpartum mood disorders, a category of conditions that, according to maternal health researchers, remains underrecognized and undertreated across the American healthcare system. Advocacy groups working on maternal mental health have pointed to the Clancy case repeatedly in calls for better screening protocols, faster access to psychiatric hospitalization for new mothers in crisis, and more caution in how quickly and how heavily postpartum patients are medicated. Whatever the jury ultimately decides about Lindsay Clancy's individual criminal responsibility, the case has already forced hospitals, insurers, and lawmakers in Massachusetts and beyond to reckon with how many warning signs can be present, how many times a person can ask for help, and still end in catastrophe. None of that, of course, changes what was lost. Cora Clancy was 5 years old. Dawson Clancy was 3. Callan Clancy was 7 months old, barely old enough to have a personality fully formed, let alone a childhood. Family members and those close to them have described Cora as an outgoing, affectionate child who loved being around her younger brothers. Whatever the jury eventually decides about the legal question of insanity, that fact does not change. 3 children who should be alive today are not, and a family that looked, from the outside, like it had everything, was in reality quietly falling apart in ways almost no one around them fully understood, until it was too late. The community of Duxbury has carried this loss publicly since the first day. In the weeks after the killings, a makeshift memorial appeared outside the Clancy family home. Flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes left by neighbors and strangers alike who had no personal connection to the family but felt compelled to mark what had happened there. Local schools offered counseling to children who had known Cora. A town that had, until that January afternoon, been known mostly for its role in Revolutionary-era history and its quiet coastline, found itself at the center of national news coverage it never asked for. 3 years later, as the trial finally gets underway, just towns away in Plymouth, that same community is watching it unfold in real time. Many of them former neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances who will spend the coming weeks deciding for themselves what they believe happened inside that house, long before any jury reaches a verdict. That is, in many ways, the hardest part of this case to sit with. This was not a stranger. This was not an intruder, or an unknown assailant, or a random act of violence in a parking lot. This was a mother who, by every account including her own family's, spent years wanting these children, caring for other people's children professionally, and reaching out for help as she felt herself slipping. And it ended the way it did anyway. There is no version of this story that offers comfort. There is only the question the state of Massachusetts and 12 jurors are now going to have to answer, in a courtroom that will be in session for weeks to come. Was Lindsay Clancy a woman who committed premeditated murder? Or was she a person whose mind had already left her, failed by a system that could not move fast enough to stop what was coming? We will be following this trial as it develops. Testimony is expected to include Patrick Clancy, medical experts for both sides, first responders who were on scene that January afternoon, and psychiatric professionals who treated Lindsay Clancy in the weeks before the killings. Given the length of this trial, expect new developments regularly over the coming weeks, and expect this story to remain far from finished by the time you finish watching this video. There's also a broader legal wrinkle worth understanding, because it shapes what a win even looks like for either side. Under Massachusetts law, if Clancy is found not guilty by reason of insanity, she does not simply walk out of the courtroom. She would instead be committed to a secure psychiatric facility, potentially for the rest of her life, with release contingent on a court eventually finding she no longer poses a danger to herself or others. In other words, this is not a binary choice between prison and freedom. It's a choice between two different forms of confinement, one clinical and one punitive, and prosecutors and defense attorneys both know that distinction is going to matter enormously to how the jury understands its own decision. Reddington has reportedly planned to make sure jurors understand this distinction clearly, arguing that an insanity verdict is not Lindsay Clancy going free, but Lindsay Clancy receiving treatment in a locked psychiatric hospital, likely for the remainder of her life, rather than being sent to state prison. The prosecution, for its part, is expected to argue that regardless of what led to that afternoon, the legal system exists to hold people accountable for the consequences of their actions, and that 3 counts of first-degree murder reflect the severity of what happened inside that house, independent of Clancy's mental state. Assistant District Attorney Julianne Campbell and her team have signaled throughout the pretrial process that they intend to present a detailed, methodical case built around the timeline of that afternoon, from the moment Patrick left the house to the moment he returned and called 911. There is also the matter of what happens to Patrick Clancy through all of this. He has, by any measure, lived through an unthinkable loss, coming home to find all 3 of his children dead, and in the years since, he has publicly and repeatedly defended the woman legally accused of causing that loss. He has continued to describe her in interviews and fundraising posts as someone whose core nature was loving, someone he believes was taken over by an illness rather than a person capable of the acts she's accused of. That position has not been universally understood or accepted, even by people sympathetic to the broader issue of postpartum mental illness, and Patrick himself has acknowledged the complexity of standing by his wife while grieving his children. As a witness for the prosecution and a very public supporter of the defense, his testimony, expected at some point in the coming weeks, may end up being one of the most closely watched moments of the entire trial. If this case affected you, we'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments, but we'd ask for a level of care in how you engage with it. This is a case built on real grief, on 3 children who are gone, and on a mental health crisis that, however it's ultimately judged in a court of law, was real. Talk about the facts. Talk about the legal question at the center of it. But remember, there is a family on both sides of this tragedy still living through it in real time. If you want to understand where this case goes next, subscribe to True Crime Vault so you don't miss our coverage as testimony begins and the trial moves forward over the coming weeks. Hit that like button if this breakdown helped you understand the case, and drop a comment letting us know what you think the jury is going to decide. These aren't just headlines. These are real families, real losses, and a real legal system now working through one of the hardest questions it can be asked. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.